presentation. Without further ado, then it's my privilege to introduce Prof. Yikan Ko from the University of Oregon to take us through this webinar. Prof. Ko, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Vinith. Hi, my name is Yegan Ko. I'm Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon and also Director of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program. So yeah, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes very special webinar on introducing a new book, Sustainable Urban Design Handbook, authored by Nico, Larco, and Kaarin Knudson. Before starting the webinar, I would like to give a short introduction of APRU and its Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program. So APRU is a global network of 61 leading research universities across the Pacific Rim. So with collective knowledge that we have, our focus is to make up a policy impact around the region. And we have many global partners, for example, like the United Nations and the Googles and like all the private sectors and the international organizations across the Pacific Rim. And APRU has 6 core Pacific Challenge programs. So to address the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, we are operating these 6 research programs under APRU. So including global health and multi-hazard, Pacific Ocean and biodiversity, and digital economy, and sustainable cities and landscapes, and sustainable waste management. So through these Pacific Challenges programs, we are addressing these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Oops. So APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program was initiated in 2016, and its hub is housed at the University of Oregon, but we have 21 core members across the Pacific Rim. And with our members, we are offering annual events like annual conferences and associated student activities like Design Field School in Galapagos. We just launched this year. And we also offer some other like student symposiums and global sustainability course, which is this course led by Nanyang Technological University, Dr. Sierra Rim. And also we offer some online global engagement like a student global climate change simulations that you can have a role play to negotiate the climate change related issues and like that. And this coming year, next year, our conference will be Vancouver, Canada, hosted by Simon Fraser University. So I'd like to welcome and invite you all to participate in, attend our conference. So it's time to introduce our moderator today. We are so excited to have Dr. Paola Boarin from the University of Auckland. So Dr. Paola Boarin is Associate Professor of Architecture, Technology, and Sustainability at Te Parae School of Architecture and Planning of the University of Auckland. And she is also the co-founder and the director of the Future Cities Research Center. And her research addresses the links across architecture, technology, and the environment, with a focus on sustainable conservation, adaptation, and retrofit of existing and heritage buildings, and regenerative design and post-occupancy evaluations. Paola is involved in transdisciplinary research groups and projects at national and international level at conjunction between design, health, and climate change impacts, and works closely with institutions, industry, and government to improve the built environment in New Zealand. And this APRU SCL webinar is also offered in partnership with the University of Auckland's Future Cities Research Center webinar series. So please welcome Dr. Paola Boarin.
Kia ora Kang and kia ora koto katoa. I will just give it a start with a brief karakia. Ina mana, ina hauefa, tēnā koto katoa, nau mai, haere mai, e kua na tēnā ko, Kuatai mai koto, ki te whakanui I te kaupapa o te rā. Nō reira I a kurangatira, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto katoa. So what I just said in Te Reo Māori is to the esteemed of the four winds, as we are all coming and joining this webinar from the four sides of the Pacific, I acknowledge you. Welcome and welcome. I'm joyful that you have arrived to support this event. And on that note, my esteemed colleagues, I greet you, I greet you, I greet you all. So welcome to this webinar and thank you, Ikan, for the introduction. This is a very important event for us because it is also offered as part of the Future Cities Research Center webinar series 2024. And I will just say a few words around the Future Cities Research Center, which was established in 2017 in the School of Architecture and Planning here at the University of Auckland, and brings together researchers addressing different disciplines concerned with the built environment and the multiple interfaces with the natural environment. The center promotes research collaborations and cross-disciplinary approaches leading to evidence-based understandings and design innovations for future cities. And our aim is to better understand the complexities of cities across the building, the neighborhood, and the urban scale. So we really work at a comprehensive level. And we try to find innovative solutions to address built and natural environment challenges, contributing to the achievement of national, regional, and global sustainable development goals. So as you will have seen probably as you joined the webinar, these will be recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to all attendees. And for those based in Aotearoa, New Zealand today, joining this webinar will give you 10 NZRAB CPD points or 1 NZPI point, depending on whether you are registered with the, let's say, Institute of Architects or Planning Institute. So let's go and discover who our speakers are today. We do have Nico Larco, who is an urban designer, an architect, and a professor. He leads the Element Urban Design, a design consulting firm, and has been a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Oregon, USA since 2004, where he is also the director of Urbanism Next Center and co-director of the Sustainable Cities Institute. Since 2018, Nico has also been a strategic advisor and researcher at TNO, a Dutch national think tank. Kaarin Knudson is a principal at Better Practice and also mayor-elect of the city of Eugene, USA. Kaarin is an architect, educator, and civic leader with more than 20 years' experience working to advance sustainable design and community-led solutions. Kaarin works with communities and organizations to integrate sustainable urban design goals, housing policy innovation, and participatory design processes in projects of all scales. Nico's and Kaarin's presentation today explore comprehensive approaches to sustainable urban design, a discipline that is still unfortunately perceived as a complicated and largely fragmented. The diversity of issues, scales, and disciplines and contexts makes it challenging to deliver integrated outcomes that measurably advance sustainability goals. Our speakers today are the authors of the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook, as Ikan said in her introduction. And this is a new resource for educators, designers, planners, developers, officials, and really anyone engaged with the creation of sustainable urban environment. The book presents a comprehensive approach that makes sustainable urban design achievable in every project, at every scale, in every city, by drawing from best practices in the field and peer-reviewed research. Nico and Kaarin will walk us through this new and very accessible and absolutely amazing graphically rich handbook. And I have to say, this is for me a very important moment because this is much more than a book launch. It's really digging into this amazingly rich resource that this book is. I've got all my post-it here on the side for things that have been really very interested into and forwarding bits and pieces to my students and my collaborators. So we are really looking forward to your presentation today. So welcome to you both, and over to you for the presentation. What I just wanted to, to say before I handed this over is for our attendees online today, please do feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. Kaarin and I will be keeping an eye on that, and we will pick up the questions for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So we're not interrupting the presentation. We let our speakers speak until the end of their communication today, and then we will assemble together to share our thoughts. Thank you. Over to you, Nico and Kaarin.
Thank you so much, Paola. I can't even tell you how happy it makes me to hear that that you're using this and that it's helpful to the work you're doing after 10 years of working on this project. It is very exciting to see that it's useful to people. I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled. And thank you, Kaarin, for the introduction as well, and for the invitation to be here. We're both very excited to be here to share a little bit of the thinking, the work that we've been doing on the Sustainable Urban Design Framework and Handbook. As mentioned, I'm Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urban Next Center, co-director of SCI, and professor here in the Department of Architecture. And Kaarin is here as well. Kaarin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I will say more in a few moments, but also an architect and an urban designer in practice for this past 20 years, and had the great fortune of working together on this research project with Nico for much of this past decade. And as Paola and Eugene mentioned in the introduction, I'm also looking to translate sustainable urban design in a little bit of a different way in the coming years as a designer and an educator, but also as the mayor of Eugene, Oregon, which is the second largest city in the state of Oregon and a part of the Pacific Northwest and Cascadia, and the home of the University of Oregon.
Great. So let me get back on here. Okay. So the basic impetus around a lot of this work was just asking the question of, like, is this place sustainable, or how do I make it sustainable? And that turns out to be a kind of complicated question that if it's too complicated, it becomes very hard to act on. But trying to understand how to approach a project and what we can do for sustainability. One thing that's absolutely clear is that there's tremendously different contexts out there. So these are images. The top one is Shanghai, the middle one is Arizona, and the bottom one is Libreville in Gabon. And what's absolutely clear about these is that these all have really different conditions. They have very different demands. Climatically, they're very different. Culturally, they're different. Politically, economically, there's a whole range of differences of what would make sustainability possible in one place or another, or what interest there might be in sustainability, and so how to do it. Turns out there's a good amount of, or there's a whole bunch of different areas that touch in sustainable urban design. One of the issues has been that if any of you are architects or have looked at architecture and sustainability, I would say urban design is about 20 or 30 years behind where architecture is, where we are still figuring out exactly what things we need to be paying attention to and how best to affect them. You can see from this slide, there's a ton of different things that we think about with sustainability in urban design, everything from obviously the transportation network to stormwater to ecological networks to things like solar panels, which I consider more in the architectural realm, but are often put out as part of urban design. So for us, it's really important for us to know, what should we be focusing on? How do we compare and evaluate different schemes, for instance, or different areas? And how do we make sure that we shed light on false claims? There's a lot of greenwashing that happens around here. Turns out there's a ton of fantastic work in sustainability related areas in urban design. What you notice at the outset is it is a lot of different disciplines that are often have fantastic work, but also very siloed work. So everything, as I mentioned, from transportation pieces to urban ecology to urban forestry to stormwater networks, how we understand parking, just a whole range of different pieces. But there's a big issue in that a lot of these things are tremendously siloed. which one, they don't know about each other, right? So if someone who knows a whole lot about, for instance, bike infrastructure might not really understand how that integrates to things like stormwater issues or ecological issues. And that creates a whole lot of problems in that we don't end up understanding the synergies between things, and also that we don't end up understanding the trade-offs between these things. So a lot of the effort that we've made is really to try to create a somewhat more comprehensive, unified approach to how you would do sustainable urban design. There are rating systems out there. So this is, hopefully some of these look familiar to you. LEED for cities and communities, which is about to have a major redo. Sites, which is much more on the landscape side. DGNB and BREEAM are used less in the United States, more in Europe, and I think some in Asia. But all these systems are typically good for evaluation. That's what they're set up for, but they're not really great design tools. I'd be hard pressed to use LEED for cities and communities with a stakeholder group or at the beginning of a design process. It gets many of these get very technical very quickly. So our goal here is to figure out how can we help people who are early in the design process think about how they might approach sustainable urban design. So in doing a whole lot of research over a number of years, and not only the sources that I showed before, we have over 1,000 sources that we've used, and we've had interviews with a number of people in a number of different disciplines that touch urban design. But for all of that, we distilled it in kind of these 5 main areas that relate to sustainability in urban design. The top one is energy use and greenhouse gas based on transportation and land use. And this is basically, how do we get people out of cars and into bike ped transit? I think this is a pretty standard one for people who look at sustainability in urban design. The next one is water, which for urban design is mostly about stormwater, how it is that the rain that falls from the sky, making sure it doesn't move horizontally a whole lot, and minimizing the amount of runoff you have, and then also mitigating the runoff when you do have runoff. Ecology and habitat, how do you create ecological areas, protect ecological areas, make sure that we're not creating problems for them, and also potentially creating microhabitat. We work at a large enough scale in urban design that we can have large effects on networks and on creating actual areas. Energy use and production for non-transportation issues is different than that number 1, energy use and greenhouse gas based on transportation and land use. This is really thinking about things like the urban heat island effect, how urban design is setting up the opportunity for architecture to be more sustainable. So thinking about solar orientation, for instance, wind orientation, and thinking about embodied energy. How is it that the decisions that we make at the urban design scale affect how much energy there is in the entire built environment? We think about embodied energy or the life cycle assessment, life cycle energy within buildings or materials. We can also think about that for different models of urban design and city form. And the last one, equity and health, we're talking about things like affordability, accessibility, safety, physical activity. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these as just an introduction here, and social mobility, how the form of the city that we live in, the urban design of the city that we live in, impacts our ability, for instance, get ourselves out of poverty, those types of things. So we think of these 5 main outcome goals as the kind of the focus for sustainability. You can divide them into these 4 main scales. So region and city, obviously large metropolitan areas. District and neighborhood, a lot of urban design projects exist at this scale, the neighborhood scale. And then block, street, and project parcel are the similar scales. It's the block and street is mostly in the public sector side, so streets, blocks, public space, and project parcel is often in the private sector side. That's not always true. Obviously, things like campus blur those. But if you do this, you get a sense of overall this kind of matrix of outcome goals and scales we work on. And what we did here is then put that added to that specific urban design elements, physical things that you can do in the city that exist within these outcome goals and within these scales. And Paola, that link I sent you, if you can put that in the chat, that will take you to a page which has, I think the first link there is the framework. So you can have a copy of this framework to help understand what we're doing here. So what this does here, as I mentioned, these are all specific physical things that you can do in urban design. What this does is it lets you think about, for instance, I've got a project at this scale. These are all the things questions that I should be asking about this project, right? In all these different areas, and thinking about how they might relate to each other, what trade-off there might be or such. You can also think about, if I'm doing a project at this scale, doing an evaluation of what's happening at these other scales to figure out what things you might be able to work off of, you might need to mitigate, you might need to work with different stakeholders or different partners to help work on those things. You can also use this to help understand if you want this outcome, if you really want to deal with stormwater issues, for instance, these are all the things that need to happen in the physical realm over all these scales to make that actually work. So I often say this is like a magic decoder ring, this framework. So if you know, and typically, your clients, your community stakeholders, they understand what they want to get out of this, this helps them understand and helps you understand what physical things need to happen to get to that. So it's a way to help affect your design decisions, understand what kinds of things you need to take care of, and also help you understand or engage stakeholders around this. So with that, I'm going to do a brief, really quick run through some of these topics just to give you a sense of how this is organized. So I'm going to go through each one of these rows just to give you a sense of the type of information that's in there. So for energy use and greenhouse gas for transportation and land use, as I mentioned, this is really about how you get yourself out of cars, how you get people out of cars and into bike ped transit, which are much more sustainable, much more equitable modes, less energy intensive for what we're talking about in this category. So at the highest scale, at the region and city scale, we're talking about things like compact development, making sure that you're building densely and not having a large metropolitan footprint. This, for instance, is the Portland area, and you can see we have what's called an urban growth boundary. So by state law in Oregon, everything outside of this red line has to be low density, and everything inside can be higher density. So you can, really limit sprawl, for instance. That is fantastic and helps actually in all the things that we're going to be talking about. So compact development is an important thing to be considering. I think Kaarin might be talking a little bit more about that later on. Other things to think about at this scale are overall transit network. So our regional transit network. How does transit work all the way across this area? Our bicycle network. So these aren't necessarily what's happening on the street, but how the whole network works. And things like regional land use mix. So understanding, thinking about ensuring that we don't have, for instance, all of residences in one part of our city, all of our businesses, all of our commerce in another part, and all of our industry in another part of the city, but making sure that that's mixed at a regional scale. At the district and neighborhood scale, there's a whole other set of things that we think about. So one of the big ones is this question of having a robust pedestrian network, making sure that you can easily walk from one place to another that has really good connectivity. And so, for instance, this is the city of Portland, which has a 200 by 200 foot grid. For those of you who don't use the imperial system, that's about 60 meters by 60 meters. It's a very small grid, one of the smallest in the United States. But in these kind of gridded development, it's very easy to get from one place to another, right? If you're going from one place to another through a fairly straight line, right? From one place to another. What happens in most of what we have in the US is suburban style development with loops and lollipops, as we call it, is that you have, let's say you live here and you're trying to get to a friend who lives right here, and that is a fairly small straight line distance. But what happens is you need to drive through here, cross there, come up, go out potentially to an arterial, come back in, come back down, and then get there, which doubles or triples the distance that you would have to walk. So not having very good street connectivity creates increased distances, which we do the obvious thing, which is you typically tell your child to get in the car and I'll take you there. So having more network connectivity helps us make a more pedestrian area. You can also think about the high density zoning and platting. So the density that's allowed in these areas, the size of the buildings that's allowed compared to this, and also the size of the lots, right? The size of the lots lets us make certain development happen where a bunch of smaller lots makes it very difficult to make larger buildings happen. Also at this scale, we're thinking about high district land use mix. So for instance, having what's often considered the 15 or 20 minute city, that in one area, instead of having single use where we see all that happening over here, we have a range of different uses that are all right next to each other, which makes walking and biking feasible, right, within that distance. At the block and street scale, we're really talking about what's called complete streets or multimodal street design. This is an image from NACDO. If you're not familiar with the Urban Street Design Guide, it is a fantastic resource from NACDO. Their whole kind of series of street design guides are fantastic. But we worked with them on this research early on. This shows like a street that has, at the block and street scale, that allows all the different uses. It has ample space and great amenities for pedestrians, for cyclists, designated lanes for transit, and it also allows the car, but it doesn't allow the car to dominate. So making sure that you have the streets allow all these different uses. You can also think about how we design parking at this scale, at the block and street scale. So where is it located within the block? Is it on the corner or within the block? What's the edge condition like? How are you making sure that it's not creating these big voids within the city, but instead creating a continuous street front that feels safe for pedestrians? And then finally, at the project and parcel scale, we're really talking about how it is that the building is interacting with the urban design, how the building is helping create activity at the urban design scale. So for example, this image on the left is high density housing over here. And then this is very much the Vancouver model of a perimeter block. And instead of having all this housing just open, being accessed from behind, typically we'll see projects that have one entrance, everyone comes in, there's a corridor in the back, and that everyone's served from there. Instead of that, this actually has entrances happening from the street. So consider the difference of the activity that this feels like, even though there's no one here on the street, just how it feels to be on the street when you have transparency and direct entrances happening from there. Similarly, as opposed to if this was all the back of these units. Similarly, on the commercial street, you can think about the amount of transparency that exists here, the amount of openings that exist here, right? All happening on the building side, but really affecting the urban design. As an example, imagine if this was a continuous brick wall on here, right? And how it would have everything else designed exactly the same, but that is a continuous brick wall would make it feel not a friendly pedestrian space. So these are all the different things that we can be doing at these different scales to help get to this outcome of more bike ped transit and less energy use and greenhouse gas production. In terms of stormwater, there's two things we want to do. One is minimize runoff, and the other one is mitigate runoff. So trying to, the more impervious surface we have, you can see that the amount of runoff that happens in a natural condition is only 10%, 25% deep infiltration. As we get more impervious surface, that changes to 5% deep infiltration, more than 5 times the amount of runoff. So this is really an enormous problem in urban areas. As I mentioned, the strategy are 1, to minimize that runoff, and 2, to mitigate the runoff. So in terms of minimizing it, it's things like compact development, where this is a watershed, and instead of having development equally spread across this entire watershed, if we concentrate that in this area might have more problems with runoff, but you leave most of the watershed untouched, which is a much better overall condition compared to something like this. We can also think about things like minimizing impervious surfaces, so making streets less wide, using permeable paving, those types of things. And we can also think about things such as the block and street scale and the project parcel scale, thinking about how we use trees. So here you can see an image of a street after rainfall, and a lot of the moisture has actually been caught in the tree canopy, in the leaves, and in the bark. So depending on what kind of trees you're using, it can actually keep a lot of the moisture from ever touching the ground and becoming runoff. In terms of mitigating the runoff, once we do have water that hits the ground and is moving horizontally, instead of putting it into a pipe, we can think about a much more sustainable action, which is trying to cool it off, slow it down, filter it, and putting it into natural systems. So this is a whole series of green stormwater infrastructure, which you can see in Block Street, that tie together to be a robust stormwater network in district and neighborhood scale. So here you have detention ponds, retention ponds, rain gardens, bioswales, these types of things that all tie together to move water and let it at all times cool off, move slowly, infiltrate into where it is, get filtered, and be part of the natural water cycle again. You also have things such as trees at the Block Street and projects parcel scale, which allow something called evapotranspiration. That is that they're pulling water out of the soil through their roots up into their canopy and then evaporating that water out into the environment. This is a great way to get water out of the soil and give it more capacity to have additional water in. So these are all ways of dealing with reducing the amount of runoff and then mitigating that runoff. In terms of ecology and habitat, there's a couple things we want to do. On the one hand, just don't touch things you shouldn't touch. So from the region and city scale, really avoiding ecologically sensitive areas, figuring out where you have critical habitat and trying not to touch those things, and then figuring out how you mitigate where you do touch it and opportunities for creating microhabitats. Often we don't think of urban areas as robust ecological areas, but there's tons of opportunity for this. And particularly one of the things that we can do is help create these robust ecological networks and these ecological corridors, which you see at the region, city, and district and neighborhood scale. So this is an urban area where you can see there's fantastic network that exists so that species can move through this and have a much more robust habitat and opportunities for a better gene pool for the species. As you look at these things and think about these robust networks, you can think about where infrastructure crosses these networks and how that's dealt with. So they're here at the block and street scale. We can think about things like wildlife crossings. Here's an example. These are simply culverts that have been modified slightly to become more accessible to different species. So for instance, this is for turtles specifically in Maine. This is for larger wildlife. And then you have, these are more expensive examples, but also tremendously effective. This is crossing a freeway, and so there's a land bridge that crosses here. This is in Texas, which lets species easily move back and forth and within a natural habitat and not feel that barrier. So you can have those consistent connections across. You can think about different types of habitat, core habitat, edge habitat, and how you buffer between habitat and development. So this slide shows what your target species might be, right? So here we're talking about robust ecological area buffers in the block and street scale, what type of species that you're most interested in, and what size of buffer you would need to help protect that species. And that might change depending on the intensity of development you have around it, or if there's a large slope, or if you have water movement between the spaces, things like that. We can also think, this is really interesting, this came out of interviews with urban ecologists, asking them, what is it that urban designers should know? And one of the things that came back is this idea at the block and street scale of high vertical complexity. If we think about how we typically do urban areas, we do this monoculture of grass or lawn, and this monoculture of trees, I call these lollipop trees, that exist within that. And this is a very not very robust ecological setup, right? It has the same culture, same species all the way through, and it does not create a range of different structures for species to thrive in. So this is what the Pacific Northwest looks like. You all should come and visit. It's beautiful. But what you see here is the canopy structure. You see smaller trees. You see bushes, sedges, ground cover, all creating a really complicated vertical structure that allows for a range of different habitat types, helping different species and also the same species at different points in their life cycle. We can do this in urban areas and things like this. So this is simply a bioswale that's collecting water coming off of a parking lot. And instead of simply going into a pipe, there's a swale that helps protect that. And instead of that swale simply having lawn, there's this complex structure here of these sedges and grasses, these taller trees, smaller trees, which really are fantastic for creating habitat in the city, specifically for insects. You can also create microhabitat. This is a park that has both has wetlands, grasslands, and oak savanna all in the same space within one area. So really a range of different ways that we can protect habitat, make sure we don't touch it where we shouldn't touch it, and then also create microhabitat. In terms of energy use and production, again, this is how we create the opportunity for sustainability in architecture, but then also think about how we are dealing with embodied energy and with the urban heat island effect. One of the issues when you think about energy use and production is that there's very different climates, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Here in the work we've done, we've divided into arid, tropical, temperate, and subarctic. And as you look at that, we've done things, for instance, to say, well, there's certain building typologies, just building typologies, not necessarily use, but different typologies that work better in these different climates. So you can see, for instance, row and bar and courtyard work really well in many of these climates. Tower, not as much. That doesn't mean we shouldn't put towers anywhere. It just means we need to understand where we are dealing best with what typologies are helping with the climate and why we might need typologies for some other things, for instance, higher density. We also have, for instance, in block and street, thinking about cool and green surfaces. This is a beautiful example in Barcelona, in the Ramblas, not the famous Ramblas, but another one of the Ramblas that exist in Barcelona, where they've actually used greening of the infrastructure to help cool the entire city down. Really nice example of that. We can also think about embodied energy, as I mentioned, within urban areas. So if you look at these 4 examples, the getting more dense as you go to the right, and you think about the amount of urban infrastructure, so streets, sewer, water lines, electrical lines, right? The amount of that you need, right? And here in this example in Florida, right? This amount like serves 1 unit, where that same amount here serves, 50 units. So the amount of energy that we're using in the built environment is completely different in these two, just based on the urban form, right? Much denser is making much better use of the overall materials that are used and reduces the energy use for those things. Okay, last one here, equity and health. These are things as I mentioned before, these 5 kind of areas that help us understand how it is we create, how the built environment creates a more equitable and healthy area. So these are issues like affordability. So thinking about a better transportation system that lets you bike, walk, or use transit, which is much more affordable than using your car. But also thinking about the range of unit types that you might have in an area, which lowers the overall cost of housing typically. Overall accessibility, which we mentioned has a lot to do with the transportation network that we talked about. Physical activity, and here we're talking about 2 things. On the one hand, how it is that we move around, so thinking about our transportation system and having more active modes, versus things like, and then also things like where we spend time exercising or moving our bodies around. So one of the key indicators of if you will do exercise today is how close you and how easy it is for you to get to a place to do that exercise. So thinking about the location of our parks and then also making them active and attractive so that different demographics, kids, so young children, teenagers, young adults, and then the elderly have the facilities they need to make that work. In terms of safety, we're talking about safety from crashes, so making sure the transportation system works well, but also thinking about things like what uses we put near each other. So making sure, for instance, a school isn't near a factory or a school isn't near a freeway, so we don't have these heavy metals or pollutants that can be causing problems. And then in terms of social mobility, there's a ton of things within the built environment that help make your ability to get yourself out of poverty work better. So having affordability, for instance, more accessibility, the ease of getting to and from a job, the ease of taking my kid to the doctor, for instance, all those things help improve your overall socioeconomic opportunities. So if we think, so that was a lot to go through. I appreciate you hanging in with that. So just to quickly talk a little bit how we might use this, I mentioned this before, but if you look at the overall framework, you can think about, as I mentioned, an outcome that you want, and then understanding these are all the physical things you need to do to get to that outcome. And then also you can think about the project scale that you're working on, and these are all the questions you need to be asking and understanding how they might relate to each other. This also helps you understand how there might be synergies or co-benefits. So for instance, thinking about how the tree location in this street or the tree decisions about what trees and where to put them, you can think about them on the one hand in terms of how it helps with your mode choice and how it helps you decide to walk or bike. So putting trees that protect you from the cars, for instance, or create a nice shaded environment. You can think about in stormwater, what types of trees you have, what kind of canopy they have, and how they hold water or evapotranspirate water. In terms of ecology and habitat, you can think about if you want to use the same tree everywhere, which we tend to do a lot in urban design, I think is becoming less favorable. or if we really want to change the species as we go through here, or add, for instance, not only trees, but also adding, smaller trees or bushes and things that create a better vertical complexity. In terms of energy use and production, we might think about, do we put the trees on the north side, the south side, the east side, the west side? How does it shade? How does it help create lower temperatures? And in terms of equity and health, we might actually think of what species of trees we use and making sure that it doesn't have allergens. So instead of having what we typically have as a fairly simple decision of, well, I'm just going to create a tree that has, I'm simply going to use a tree that we used, a block over, we can make much more sophisticated decisions. I'm going to skip through this just in the interest of time. So there's all these different ways to use the framework, thinking about it as a design tool, looking at existing conditions or to evaluate different schemes. So we can look at a scheme and think about how it functions or how it performs in each one of these areas. We can think about it, as I mentioned, for client and stakeholder engagement. And we can also think about it in design team composition. So both for when you're working at school or when you're working professionally, do we have people who understand all these different areas so that we can have a good basis for design? So the framework itself with all these different pieces is actually, we've been working the last 10 years, Kaarin and I, in putting together the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook, which is the book that Paola just showed you. And just to show you a little bit of how it's organized, this is an example of one of the chapters. Each element in the framework has its own chapter, and each chapter is organized like this. It has what we call a dashboard page, which tells you a little bit about the topic itself. This is the robust ecological area buffers. For those of you who don't know what it is, there's a paragraph that helps describe that. We talk about metrics. We talk about related urban design elements. So what is it that this element influences and what it's influenced by? So you start to understand the connections across these things. Implementation, so how it works in greenfield and retrofit situations in terms of cost and difficulty, pretty much how expensive it is and what is the political capital involved. A section on the recommended approach, so you get a sense of what you're trying to do. Typical approach, this is what we often do when we build, which is often not the recommended approach. We have a section on importance, which really looks mostly at peer-reviewed research and also some professional best practices. Each section also has a background section, or each element, I should say, element chapter has a background section, which gives you a more background on the topic, for instance, where to buffer or some characteristics of buffers that are important. And then we have a section on consideration and caveats, which is meant to give you a little bit more nuance on the types of things you should be understanding about this. So element interactions, political issues, maintenance and operations issues, and then other issues you can think about. And then finally, we have guidelines for urban design. These are basic rules of thumb that you can be following to help make good urban design decisions at the schematic design phase, right? So this gives you a sense of the kinds of things that are in here. There's been a fantastic group of people who've helped put this together, students, professors, and professionals who are listed here and also in the book. And with that, maybe I will pass it on over to Kaarin.
Thank you, Nico. And I think if you stop sharing, I will be able to share. And let's see here. Hopefully that is looking okay for everyone. Nico, thank you for reviewing all of that information. I now will do my part to drill down a little bit into this work, and I hope also share some ways that this is directly applicable to the work that you all are doing as designers, as professionals and educators, and also how this work connects to the general public. On the very first page of this book, an introduction to this research, and my thoughts about the dedication to this work have to do with expressing gratitude to all of the people who are engaging with the work to create a sustainable future with urgency and optimism. And I presume absolutely that that's why you all are here this evening, because you are looking for tools and connections and community that can assist you in the work of engaging an incredibly complex crisis that presents an extraordinary number of ways in our communities, but also that you feel a responsibility and a delight in the work of building community and building the environment within which we all live, the lives which we enjoy. So I'll just walk through a little bit of motivation and background in terms of the drive to spend years of life working on this book. And what I'll share simply is that by engaging with students over a number of years and as a practitioner in practice was really clear when working with students, especially advanced students, that by the time they understood some of the basics about urban form and the way in which we might organize places, questions very quickly became focused on what Nico was describing at the beginning of this presentation. How do we know that what we're doing is actually going to help? How do we know that the way in which we're organizing all of these different elements and thinking about all of these interrelated concerns is actually going to help us to move the needle and improve the condition on this planet and in our communities for our current generations and also for future generations? And that was incredibly motivating to see the ways in which students understand all of these different issues that were relevant. And it's, I think, incredibly bold, but also really optimistic for us to think that we could assemble a resource and a tool in this handbook that would be able to help people to do this work. So as Nico mentioned, and I won't review all of these in detail, what we're really looking for are some key shifts in terms of urban design outcomes.
Kaarin, sorry to interrupt you,
yes.
but
Yes.
I think some of the things that are on your window are blocking the slides. So if you could move those out of
no.
the way, yeah,
Let's
that'll make, there you go. That's better.
Did that work?
Yeah, that worked.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think that's the toolbar at the top of my screen. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, sorry
Nico.
to interrupt. Yeah.
Nope, you're totally fine. So just, as a reminder that we really are looking to change the outcomes and to change the approaches and the ways in which we are assembling all of these different elements within our cities, and we're seeking to deliver more integrated outcomes and to shift from patterns of development that tend to be very fossil fuel intensive and emit an enormous amount of pollution into our communities towards patterns of development that allow for people to use active modes of transportation and not rely on individual vehicles to be able to access their daily needs. And that we want to see our urban environments protect natural water systems and minimize the impacts of urbanization within the areas that we occupy, and that we want to maintain the ecological functionality of the environments that we live in. And this is possible through the care with which we deploy these different elements. Lastly, as Nico mentioned, really making sure that we're not leaving all of the work of passive design and the opportunities of passive design to the building scale, but that we're thinking about the ways in which the urban environment and urban design decisions set the stage for all of those opportunities to think about passive cooling, passive heating, and passive ventilation at the building scale, but also the health and the comfort of the surrounding public realm. And then lastly, of course, and this is a current event, I think everywhere in the world, as we're thinking about a transforming climate, but also about the inequities that persist across communities, that we are truly developing urban networks and systems that expand the access to opportunity and the equity of opportunity that exists within cities. That means, of course, robust transportation networks that serve people and that support their lifelong health, but also that we're thinking about the density and the diversity of the neighborhoods that we're designing and the access to affordable and appropriate housing within those areas, and that we're really minimizing the existence of point source pollution within any community. As Nico and I have been talking with people about this project over this last several years, and certainly as the book has become an accessible resource for folks, what feels very apparent is that everything that Nico just shared and the work of people who are engaged with sustainable urban design often feels overwhelming, and that there is an enormous number of levers, an enormous number of ways in which we might affect sustainable outcomes, but that for us as designers and practitioners and educators to be able to chart a path through that somewhat overwhelming response is a core competency and a core responsibility of this work. So as mentioned, we have these 51 different elements deployed across 4 different scales of opportunity, with each project, of course, existing at a particular scale, and 5 different topics that allow for us to make measurable progress. As we thought about this book and how to organize all this information, Nico just walked through this very quickly with a chapter example, but this is a snapshot from within the book. It was incredibly important to us that as designers that this information be visually accessible, and that we did as much as we could through the process of actually presenting and curating this information to people. That's something that seems like it might be overwhelming, or that the complexity might be too great to undertake with any particular project, that we would design this book to actually support people through that work. And so as you dig into this book and are thinking about the potential of what's here, that was really at a centering motivation as we're thinking about each of these chapters and how to lay out what is important to understand about compact development, for example, and the ways in which our cities are basically organized. And that being presented to people with an overarching summary and an understanding of metrics and of the ease in which it's accessible or can be achieved was foundational to that work. But within each chapter of this book, we also dive into the research and the details that support an understanding of the importance of these different sustainable urban design elements. So for example, understanding compact development in comparison to sprawl, and capturing and adapting research from Todd Littman, for example, at the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, to help convey the very clear impacts of sprawl and how it differs from compact development in a visual sense, that of course we have increased per capita land development, which is going to make it very difficult for us to maintain natural spaces, functional ecological systems uninfluenced by urbanism, and also is going to reduce our access to agriculture. But in a second path of concerns also means that as we're sprawling, rather than developing in a more compact manner, every one of the activities that we need to access in our daily life is more dispersed. And there's a greater distance between destinations, which reduces accessibility, puts a higher cost on public infrastructure and services, and reduces the time that people have in their everyday life because it takes so much longer to get from place to place. In each chapter, with information like that, we try to present this content in very straightforward ways. So simple comparisons of compact development as a higher density, mixed use, well-connected development pattern that can be understood in narrative, but also in graphic representation and examples such as San Francisco, in comparison to a condition like the sprawling development pattern, uncoordinated, autocentric, low density, and disconnected. It's characterized in a number of ways, specifically the segregation of land uses in a very disconnected pattern across a very large area. And that we can also see that in comparisons like this example from Kingsport, Tennessee, which is one of the most sprawling urbanized areas within the continental United States. Also important to understand that if the goal of that compact development is related to, which is reducing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, that delivers all the way to the block scale and the parcel scale. And that as we're thinking about compact development patterns, we're also thinking about the quality of that development pattern in a very specific way. And that we know from research that active street edges support people's decision to walk and to walk longer distances, or to use transit, or to ride a bicycle through urban places. And that helping designers and practitioners and educators to understand what the components of active street edges are and how those could be deployed in any number of ways was incredibly important. So this is another of those snapshots from the guidelines that accompany every one of the 51 chapters within this book. The other big piece takeaway, and we talk about this often as co-benefits within the world of sustainability and urban design. But for most people within the world, really what we're talking about is interconnected concerns and helping communities to see the ways in which decisions that we make about the built environment can have multiple positive associations and positive outcomes attached to them, and that we can see many reasons why a development pattern that prioritizes more sustainable outcomes might be beneficial within communities. So picking up on the example from Barcelona and the chapter focused on the urban forest canopy, as many of you well know, the urban forest canopy and a robust urban forest canopy is one of the most influential elements of sustainable urban design. In our research, we found that this element has influence across all 5 of the measurable topic areas of sustainable urban design and connects to numerous other elements because of all of the positive benefits in urban areas that come from trees. So presenting this chapter and that information was one important step. But with this research, what we're hoping to also do is to help people understand how things like a robust urban forest canopy that many people might care about, right? It's an accessible element of urban design. It's a visible element within the city, trees, and people feel attached to trees and delight from trees, and they appreciate trees. They may not be as connected to the idea of ecological corridors and patches. And they may not understand the ways in which a robust urban forest can support ecological corridors and be a part of creating really habitat-rich patches and functional ecologies. They also may not be as familiar with the elements of ecological networks, the components of ecological networks, and how those different components relate to one another, including the core area, the buffer zone, landscape corridors, and stepping stone corridors and linear corridors, to make this information visually accessible to people and to directly connect concepts like an ecological network to elements like beautiful trees along a boulevard that someone may walk every day of their lives. Really powerful and important work if we are trying to green cities and encourage more people these environments and development patterns that prioritize these elements. Similarly, a third chapter directly connecting to that element having to do with ecological buffers and the ways in which ecological buffers are designed to accomplish 4 different goals: to filter, insulate, connect, and provide habitat within urban areas. And that may, again, not be what people are thinking about when they're thinking about a robust urban forest and the trees that they love along their street. And further, to Nico's last example, the connection between the ways in which those trees along that street and that landscaped element are designed, and how that can be designed to deliver microhabitat in urban areas that is truly performative, contributing to those larger networks and systems that I just described, and to present this information in a way that is very accessible to people and that translates across different cityscapes and across different development patterns within cities. And then finally, connecting, as all of the elements within this book do, and through the framework that Nico shared, but the organization of this research, to connect elements like a robust urban forest canopy back to our goals around walkability and the design of pedestrian-friendly streets and multimodal streets, and that trees also play an incredibly important role in the creation and the design of those spaces. They require space. They cannot be planned for after the fact, why it's so important for designers to be carrying forward that information. But it's also incredibly important for people who might be advocates for trees to also understand that they can be advocates for walkability and pedestrian-friendly spaces at the same time and with the same outcomes in place. The other aspect that this research and this work helps us to navigate is both understanding and making visible our values, but also helping us to overcome conflicts and to navigate that process of understanding the trade-offs and the complicating factors that come along with designing urban places where there's never enough room for everything that we want to accomplish in one place. So in some of this work, I've worked with community groups and organizations to actually understand how they might pursue the allocation of resources relative to specific infrastructure investments as they relate to the topic areas included in the book and the ways in which we've organized all of these elements relative to those topic areas. Incredibly important, because oftentimes you will be talking with people about a particular plan or a particular project, working with a community to understand a particular challenge or opportunity, and the ways in which different values translate and can find their way into a sustainable urban design approach largely has to do with the practitioner's familiarity with how those different elements can translate into measurable outcomes. And we're really hoping to support that understanding with this work. The other and final point, I think, really that I want to share in thinking about this translation is that cities are clients when you think about a particular type of work, and that educators and practitioners have opportunities to link across all the networks of sustainable outcomes and all the scales of sustainable outcomes if they know what's important. And so as we're thinking about different patterns of development and ways in which transit networks and pedestrian networks and bicycle networks and dense and street activating building types and pedestrian connectivity through spaces and a high degree of street connectivity connect to a place in a project, when you as a practitioner or a student are trying to engage from a particular point of entry, you have the capacity to stretch across all of these different concerns and multiply the positive influence of your work. The same is true when looking at natural systems and ecological networks within cities, and that we can translate from any scale of development to the other scales if we know what's important and how to connect this work. And as Nico alluded to, we can actually outline the process to be able to navigate how we overcome conflicts. Things like a highway or a throughway across a piece of our ecological network within a city, and how it is that we might actually design in all of the different specific contexts, wildlife crossings and passages that allow for that larger habitat quality to be maintained and for movement to continue across this space. So we're hoping that this resource is helpful to you in all of these different ways and across all of the different project types and scales of work that you find yourself engaging. It is the challenge of our time to integrate the knowledge that we have and to move from specialized knowledge in all of these deep areas of study to information that will allow for each one of us to be a very well-informed generalist as we're engaging each of these projects. And we hope that this handbook and this research helps you to do that. So with that, I will just say thank you. And I think we will open it up to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Kaarin. And this was a beautiful presentation, I have to say. Very, you went very deep into the structure of the book, which is really great for everyone to see. I think it really gives the idea of a tool, something that is useful on an operational level as well, on a design, on a planning, but also on an operational level, which is exactly what I feel was missing in the literature, not only from an academic perspective, but also from a practice perspective. So that is, again, the output of your work is very welcome. While I encourage everyone to keep posting the questions in the QA box, just a couple of thoughts from my side. I really loved the focus on co-benefits. I mean, the moment we do something, let's think more holistically at how we can maximize the positive outcomes that can result from a single strategy. So thinking holistically and across disciplines, we really can foster that extended benefit for the built environment and the natural environment, and let's say through the planning practice and the urban design practice. And I think this is a really important message also for practice. I mean, practice as in the past has been thinking in silos a little bit, and the result that we see in the built environment are actually a manifestation of that, let's say, very focused attention on individual elements and individual strategies. So your let's say recurrent cross connections throughout the framework is really very important to open up and think more holistically. That is, in my view, extremely important also when it comes to the achievement of sustainable development goals. As again, we cannot think in silo. The benefits related, for instance, to health are achievable through the built environment and are related to let's say, overcoming poverty and fostering more equitable environments. So it's not only from, let's say, a sustainability focused on planning perspective, but it's also in regards to the achievement of our sustainable development goals at global level. I also really loved that you brought the attention also on health and how, let's say, our cities, our buildings, and all the interconnected elements and scales in between can really foster that improved health and well-being, if I may add, of all people within the cities at all ages. And let's say it's a very inclusive concept, that of health and well-being. And I really love the attention in the handbook and in your presentation on that as well. I think it's an aspect that, again, has been not prioritized as much as it should in the past practices. And let's say, again, in light of the achievement of co-benefits, it's a really important goal. Enough about me, because we've got a lot of questions here, and I was reading through them. There's a number of questions that reflect also the attention on stakeholder engagement. So what I think has been quite interesting for me to see in your book is that mentality shift around, we need to change our culture and how this culture is reflected through practice. But of course, this involves engagement from a wide group of stakeholders. So how can we use the framework to engage, let's say, a wider audience, so that, again, we maximize the benefits and we bring that positive outcomes that we're looking for?
That is a great question. And first of all, I just want to say that the comments you had at the end of the presentation, fantastic to hear those, especially like the idea of this being a tool, because that was really the goal of this, that it was a tool for, you know, students, academics, to understand how you get your arms around this topic, but really also for practitioners of figuring out how it is that you can actually apply these things. In response to your question about you know, how do you get people to do these things, how especially like stakeholders think about these things, we understand that it's not a clear answer to that, right? And this is really a tool. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't say exactly what you have to do, but it's a tool to help practitioners and stakeholders understand what topics they should be dealing with. And then, as I mentioned before, this like translator tool of like, oh, I'd really like for there to be like less cars here, right? Well, these are all the things that you have to do that. So sometimes it's just a question of understanding how you do the things that you'd like, right? Oh, I would love to have this thing to be, you know, a place that is, you know, more ecologically robust. Well, these are the ways that you do that. So sometimes we just don't have, especially for people, stakeholders and clients who don't work in the built environment, that connection is just lacking. So hopefully it's helpful for that. The second part is really that hopefully it's helping people understand how there might be opportunities for co-benefits around this, and like, you know, that you can actually have partnerships for this. So someone who really wants, for instance, bike infrastructure might realize that, oh, well, this bike infrastructure can also, for instance, be stormwater infrastructure, and can also be moments for ecological benefit, which helps them build coalition, right? So you can say, we'd like to create this bike path. Oh, and we're going to work with all these different groups to help make that happen. It helps you, for instance, look for different sources of funding for this. In the end, like the idea is trying to give people tools so that they can be more effective and have meet people where they're at, answer the things that they're trying to get to, right?
Mm-hmm. That very well said, Nico and Paola. I would add that one of a couple of thoughts. One is that some of the most fascinating research in this process for me personally was reading the observations from ecologists and biologists, botanists, people working at a pretty deep scientific level on biodiversity, habitat, and ecology. And their own observations within their abstracts and research summaries, that the language and the specificity of the science needed in order to reach conclusions was in itself inaccessible for many other areas of expertise, and specifically inaccessible to generalists who might be asking questions about ecological corridors, but then as they're trying to learn about them, they find themselves reading about conservation corridors. And then as they read a little bit further, they find themselves reading about conservation areas. And then they move into a whole different realm of concern spatially that makes it really difficult to track across the issues. So one of the things that we worked very hard to do, it's why it took, one of the reasons why it took so long for this book to arrive in the world, was the work of with fidelity, translating that deep science and that very specific knowledge and expertise into something that could be useful to a person who is working on 5 different projects within a calendar year. And that there's an understanding of ecological systems and habitat that's needed in order to do that. And so that you can engage effectively with expertise and consultants who can add to that base knowledge and really create something beautiful and extraordinary. The other piece with this is that, and Nico mentioned the coalition building and the ways in which, by better understanding how we are assembling all the components of cities every day, right? We're building them and expanding them and changing them every day, that for people to understand the different trade-offs in decisions, like if we think about a higher density of development for this housing type, for example, or these housing units, we think about a higher density building type, that may allow for different opportunities in terms of the open space network and the ecological conditions within our neighborhood. And in a very specific way, that might allow for proximate access to a regional open space network, that we can measure the positive influence on people's lives over their lifespan. That when people have access to those types of open spaces and have, that they are both proximate to large open spaces, regional quality open spaces, and also have safe access to them, they use them all the time. And they use them to be physically active, to have greater mental health, to spend time with their loved ones, to be out within community. And that's the type of connection that people advocate for and that communities mobilize around advocacy for. But we have to do some translating as practitioners and researchers and guides for people to understand what they might be benefiting from.
Yeah, sure. No, it's really important. And just a note on what you said around creating this language to make the knowledge transfer possible. So the accessible language is definitely the first step to create impact and create impact beyond academia as well. So it's a really important aspect. There's a question in the Q&A that is really intriguing to me, and it's asking how basically we can use the learning from your tool and the tool itself on consolidated built environment. So when we have to work with existing cities, existing neighborhoods, existing built form, of course, things are much more complicated than having, you know, the blank slate of the greenfield development. So how do we use and how can the tool help in such cases and the framework?
So one of the things that we've done, so for instance, we've done work here in Portland in an area called the Lloyd District, which is an existing area with a old kind of dying mall, a lot of existing development. And the first pass at looking at this, and the city and the developer who owned the mall were interested in having us look at how you might redevelop this area to be more sustainable. And the first thing to do is just do an analysis with the framework. So looking through each element of the framework and saying, is this working well, easy, great? Is it okay? Or is it really a hard, like it'd be a difficult lift to make that thing work, right? So you almost get like a landscape of this is what's working, this is what's not. And that's going to be true in any environment. And then the two things you need to do is one, figure out what your priorities are. What are the things we really want to try to get to? Because you can't do everything. And then two, what are the things that I can affect in the project that I have that help us get to that outcome? So you can picture, the entire framework. So for instance, when we do this, the entire framework has like green things, orange things and yellow things, right? Things that are really easy, things that are not, or already working well, things that are not so well, and things that are really hard. And this is the outcome we want. Well, those like yellow things are the things we should probably pay attention to the most, right? Like the things like how can we affect those things, or how do we create partnerships around that? So absolutely, in existing development, this is absolutely usable. One, to understand where you're at and help you direct where to put attention, and then the things. So that's for the framework, but then the book helps you understand, well, how can I modify that thing?
And Paola, I would just add that when I talk with my students about the landscape of the 20th century, that in many cases they are engaging with the retrofitting of. One of the aspects that we think this tool will really help with, and that we hope the book is helpful as people are engaging, is that those previously developed places, that maybe a dying mall in the example that Nico mentioned, maybe a big box store, maybe an area that was developed with a really poor plan for transportation and a larger network of transportation serving that site and a large area of surface parking. Those places need typically multiple reasons for attention. And the way in which this work is organized, we think, will help people to be able to see more of the opportunities that are present in those sites. I would say in general, and if what you're also alluding to is cities that are already of a very high density and a consolidated pattern. Coming back to these 5 measurable areas that we know that we can always improve upon. And in very high density environments, a lot of that is going to come back to be focused on energy use within buildings, of course, but also the ecology and habitat and the water systems within that place, and the ways in which natural systems and biodiversity can still be supported when there's a really intensive type of development already happening.
Right, yeah. I'm afraid I'm going into a very difficult question now. We've got a very interesting one here in our Q&A box. The question is, what do you believe is the single most important factor in sustainable urban design? And I know that after you've been delving and digging quite deeply into all the different aspects, all the different factors, and all the different impacts, elevating these to a very high level of, at the core, what is really important in terms of sustainable urban design?
This is a great question, and people often ask, so okay, so you've looked at all this. What's the most important thing?
We can only do one thing. What do we do?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe I can allow you one each if you want.
So for me, the most important one is density. Density of development helps, and the corollary of that is compact development. But density doesn't necessarily guarantee things, but there's a ton of stuff that we want to do that's just impossible if you don't have density, right? If you don't have density, if you have sprawl, then all of your transportation infrastructure is really hard to make work outside of the car. Your stormwater network's much more difficult to deal with. Your ecological networks, you've like ruined things everywhere as opposed to like concentrating where you have impact. In terms of equity, it creates huge problems. So I'll say clearly to students, if there's one thing that you can really push, it is more dense environments. And this doesn't mean like, oppressive, enormous, although, there are wonderful places that have tremendously high density, but figuring out ways that you can have, I'd say, a livable density, a density that feels good and humane and has all sorts of amenities with it. Absolutely important. I would say that is a huge place to focus.
Yeah, and honestly, it couldn't be more aligned with the current trend in New Zealand as well. New Zealand and Auckland particularly has been moving to building at higher density, and that was also one of the main topics in the National Science Challenge 11 research. The future cities and the team here at the School of Architecture and Planning, the University of Auckland, has been involved for almost 4 years, and there exactly the living well at density was a very important topic, and living well not only from a human perspective but also from an ecological perspective. So I'm 100% with you on that. Kaarin, what's yours top pick?
Well, with density covered, I would say the natural pairing to that is going to be our open space and ecological networks. And depending on the city and the context, right? So because that's going to be dependent upon the natural condition and landscape within different cities. But if that is delivered through the extent of a robust urban forest canopy in particular, climate types, or through the existence of really robust ecological networks through cities, those networks, I think, are what allow for us to have that high quality of life experience while living in a more compact way. And they are also ways in which cities can be better knitted back into the natural context that they exist within. So I think, that those make a really natural, beautiful pair. And I will say, I believe it was the APRU webinar last week, the horticulturist from Oregon State who spoke, you'll probably remember this research very well, I thought was a fascinating comparison that was shared when looking at high density neighborhoods in Chicago and the abundance and the productivity of pollinators within those spaces, which was essentially about humans being really productive contributors to a functional ecology within an urban environment. And even in these tiny little pieces of all of these little gardens in this very high density area of Chicago, that actually had the highest ecological performance from her perspective. But I think a really interesting way of observing that we can, as apex species, knit ourselves back into the systems that we are a part of and be contributors in ways that are not about our own personal experience, but we do still benefit from those outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm changing flavor for this next question, as I really want to be a little bit comprehensive with the set of topics we touch with this during this conversation. And I would like to open, let's say, the box around smart technologies and cities. So the question that we've got is around the implementation of smart technologies through sustainable urban design, and how can that facilitate better climate risk management or foster innovations that can also have co-benefits around the social equity sphere within urban communities.
Do you want to take first pass at that, Kaarin, or do you want me to do that?
Nico, I think, well, and also in interest of time, I think the research that you're doing with Urbanism Next is the natural connection to some of that question. I would say in general, all of that technology allows us to be much more efficient and much more nuanced and circumstantial in how we respond to the built environment and the natural environments that we're imposing upon. So in that way, very advantageous to us. Do we still need to do a lot of what I would categorize as the dumb urbanism stuff a lot better? Yes, we absolutely do. We need to make places more walkable and greener. But there's a lot of other tools that we can now use to improve upon our metrics in several other ways.
Yeah, so I, in addition to the sustainable urban design work, I also do work on emerging technology and its impact on cities. So if you're interested, Urbanism Next is a center that I run that looks a lot at how shared mobility and self-driving cars and e-commerce are kind of impacting cities. So we look at a lot of those types of technologies. And the thing that I say over and over again is that even looking at all those things, the old rules are still the new rules, right? So as Kaarin was saying, dense, mixed use, compact development, multimodal are still the things that we need to be doing. So the thanks, Eugene, for putting the link in the chat. These technologies can help with these things, but unless you have the bones there, they are not the one. I don't think they have the heft to be able to carry the ability to actually carry the main amount of work that we need done in terms of sustainability. But also, some of those technologies are proving not to be as effective as we thought, or might have negative side effects. So self-driving cars actually seem to be inducing sprawl, or would induce sprawl, and create potentially a lot less expanded, or a lot more expanded metropolitan footprints and a lot lower densities. So I feel like those old rules are still the new rules, and we have to think about how we incorporate some of these emerging technologies into this. But still, some of the things that we've been doing, I think, that we've known for years, and that I think the book covers a whole lot of, it's really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. Ikan, perhaps I'll hand over to you for a last question and then the closing.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for this fantastic presentation and discussions. I also feel like this book was like a cooking book, for example. Like if I'm a cook and I look at like I'm trying to find ecology at the block level and then find the ingredients and then going to the recipe. So if I'm an urban designer, it's really easy to implement and easy to cook. So previously, my favorite sustainable urban design book was 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities by Patrick Condon. But now
Yeah.
I'm sorry for him, but switching to your book, giving
Ah,
lots of examples.
And I'll
They
say
can
we
be-
learned from Patrick Condon. He was he's done fantastic work. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think you upgraded that his version to more like really comprehensive and systematic approach to have every single examples of what urban designers can looking for. So, and I also agree that this density and open space connectivity could be like a two overarching kind of proxy to many other sustainable design metrics that can really have a lot of co-benefits in other areas. And I think going back to our Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program under APRU, we have this audience from a wide range of cities that has from like a low density to super high density. And especially we have a lot of students from Singapore, Seoul, and Auckland, and Mexico City, Monterey, and we have a wide range of students having different level of density in their everyday life. And I want our students and other audience to think about this livable density, what would be kind of pleasant density that are sustainable, but also pleasant in my everyday life. So that's one thing that I want to also ask to our audience as well. Like Hong Kong, yeah, also Hong Kong, yeah. All right. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and discussion. And so we are happy to close the webinar. Maybe Paola, would you like to say something at the end?
If I could say one thing really quick.
Yeah.
So for students, you can do this. Like this is as we mentioned before, this seems like a tremendously complicated project, tremendously complicated topic. You can break it down into pieces, understand it, and have action on it. And going with what Yukang said was just saying, there's a ton of different environments that exist. Not everything's going to be dense and multimodal and mixed use. That's okay. Whatever project you have, whatever project you might have, whatever scale, whatever location, trying to figure out how you can make it as sustainable as possible with the realities of that climate and that economic situation and that cultural situation and that political situation. Great. We might not be able to do everything everywhere, but making everything a little bit better is a really important step. So I just want to encourage people to, use this and feel like the strength to be able to help move the needle and wherever it is they can. It's super important in all kinds of projects.
Our hope
Definitely.
is that it's
Couldn't agree more.
very empowering in that way, and that you all feel like this work is more accessible. You have a better sense of what would be positively influential, where to begin from, and then have the freedom to still design in response to the specific contexts and the place that you are working to care for. So I love the comparison to a cooking book, because I think that we do want it to be beloved and referenced in the way that those have been over time. But really just hope that this makes a world of questions and design decisions much more accessible to everyone who's trying to influence sustainable outcomes.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Nico, and thank you, Kaarin, for your really amazing presentation, very thoughtful presentation today. I've seen there's a few students from the University of Auckland online. this is already, oh, you can't see it very well. There we go. This is already in our library, so you can access that online in the digital version or in the printed version. And for me, it's just a series of thank yous at this point. Thank you to the University of Oregon, Nanyang Technological University, the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, and the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub for this really terrific event, for the organization of this event, but also the School of Architecture and Planning, the Faculty of Creative Arts and Industries at the University of Auckland for, again, the contribution from a webinar perspective here on a local level. So again, thank you very much. I know that the conversation needs to continue with the participants to the student participant to the Global Sustainability course. So I would like everyone else who's not enrolled in that course to leave the Zoom. And again, thank you very much to Nico and Kaarin again for your presentation today.
Thank you, Paola, for organizing all this, and huge thanks to Yukang for making this all happen. Really appreciate all the help in making this work. Great to be here.
And
thank you all so much.
From the APRU
Pleasure.
Global Sustainability course, thank you also to Nico, Kaarin, and Paola. We hope to see you again next year.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. All right. Thank you again.